welcome back to most of you. Welcome to a few of you, I think. I don't know, I'm Brad Binau, member here, recently retired faculty person from Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University. Michelle is nodding her head as if to say, yes, Brad, you have it right. You haven't totally lost your mind in retirement. Thank you for affirming my memory. Right. We're going to start today by backing up to last week. There were some things about Darwin and evolution that I wanted to get in focus, which actually is a good tie into where we're going today. The half sheet of paper in front of you, that's actually next week's handout, which, as you can see, has nothing on it. I wondered from the very beginning what we do in the final week, and I wanted to stay open, and I think it'll work to the fact that let's have a lot of discussion and insight giving and whatnot next week. So if you want, write down before you go and give it to me, either I think a question you have, an insight you've gotten, especially interested in, has anything shifted in your theology because of this that you want to share? So this isn't just Q&A type stuff. It'll be, let's all pilot. And if you don't think of anything today, that's fine. You can email me through the week if you want. Simple. Binau at capital.edu, still have my seminary email. If you give anything back today or over the week, I'll try to just do something of package things together. Maybe some people have similar thoughts and we can cluster them. And if you just come next week with something off the top of your head, or as one of my parishioners famously once said, the best mixed metaphor of all time, just a gut level reaction off the top of your head. That's fine too. Okay. But today, to plunge in, I've asked for some help in reading. I forgot to put on the handout, but Revelation, by the way, it is Revelation, just one, not plural, but there's one Revelation. The last chapter, the first 5.5 verses.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who is seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new."
Great, thank you. So just we'll get to a little more exploration of that in just a bit as we move deeper into Einstein's thinking. But think of that as a bookend to the passage that we began with last week from John's Gospel about in the beginning was the Word, John's version of creation. Now here's John's vision of the culmination of creation and everything being made new. We'll get to that. Okay, but to back up a little bit into, well, let me first of all say, if just to remind us all again, if you weren't here, why all these books here. That's just a reminder of the timeline that's up here on the board. 13.8 billion years, as best we know, give or take, a couple 100 million or so, maybe a billion. If you had 30 volumes, 450 pages of volume, that means 1 million years per page. You'd have roughly 0.8 billion years. And what we have recognized is kind of striking about that is from whatever we go as time equals 0, you do about 20 volumes in before you even get to what we now know as the formation of our solar system, and 21 volumes, so about 2/3 of the way through, before we have any sense or evidence that life of any sort emerged, let alone as you get almost up to the very end where we have fossil records of multicellular life, something more complicated, and everything clusters right here at the very last volume where you have much more developed life, primates, and you get kind of to the last paragraph, few lines of the last volume of the whatever, and we show up, which is suggests that, you know, there are almost inevitably, well, there will be many more volumes. And so this is not, in a sense, the end. It's just where we happen to be. And as I said before, I think in the very beginning, even if the whole of the human race were to vanish tomorrow from an asteroid or some catastrophe, that does not mean the end of history. I mean, it'd be the end of human history, but we're trying to expand our thinking here that the end of human history is not the end of God's history. Just as human beings showing up, obviously, in the last page of whatever, is not the beginning of God's history. We're all the way back to something. Okay. That all make clear? Make sense? Okay. So are you on the same page? That's a bad. Whatever. Okay. Let's go back to Darwin for a few minutes. We lifted up the thought that some have had that, you know, Darwin had a dangerous idea. Well, that depends on how you look at what Darwin discovered and authored and lifted up. That in fact, creation did not happen, at least in terms of life, did not happen instantaneously. It unfolded and revealed itself and evolved over literally billions of years. And in terms of Homo sapiens, a mere hundreds of thousands of years, so forth. So there are a couple of things to, and I mentioned the challenge that some have offered, that our theology, the church needs to reach and stretch toward a God who is big enough to incorporate these insights and big enough to really allow us to see the majesty of it all. We're, I think the first week I mentioned that little book, Your God is Too Small, and how confining that can be if we can't have a theology that responds to what the natural world is telling us and what science is giving us. Because there's always a choice to, you know, do you either, you know, deny science and just say, I'm comfortable with the God I've got, and so this doesn't make any sense. I'll have a much more tight creation and put human beings at the pinnacle of it and just deny whatever science may be suggesting. Or do I take that all very seriously, as this first quote says, that theology needs to allow purely natural explanations to be taken as far as they can possibly go? And then does that mean I need to rethink some things in my theology so that I don't limit who God is or what God is doing? So three things just to get on the table here that in order to allow God to be big enough to really make sense of evolution, there are three principles: contingency, predictability, temporality, or I've given some other names to those here. We'll explain those as we go along. This is all part of what Teilhard de Chardin said, is a Jesuit priest, geologist, paleontologist, forward thinker, all part of what he said about giving evolution its own God. So contingency, what are we talking about? That's the principles of chance, or I really like the word novelty, that there is in the cosmos the real possibility of something new happening, novel. There are these random, accidental, unpredictable things that occur. Why does one species go out of existence and another branches off, and oh, we've got something new going here? I mean, that, again, millions of years, but Darwin pointed that out. It wasn't all dropped instantaneously in one piece at one time, and that's the done deal. Things happen. Now we know that stars are still out there dying and being born. All kinds of novelty is there. And the idea that novel things can happen goes along with the idea that creation is in fact going someplace. There's an ongoing story here. Newness is happening. Evolution is carrying things forward. Without the principle of novelty, as some have pointed out, we'd be stuck in a creation that is basically, I like this word, monotonous. It would just be the same thing. It's just there. Nothing new is happening. Just on you go, on you go, on you go. And I'm trying to contrast the difference between being and becoming. We talk about ourselves as human beings. I've been trying to say, I think really we are human becomings. We're on the way toward something more grand, more full. And on any given day, you know, between noon and 3 or 9 and 5, you can't really see much of that happening. Okay, it takes a long period of time to see that unfolding. But the idea is that we are becoming, and that also gives us then a way to talk about sin as something that is unbecoming. It's not very nice, but it also means you're just not, you're stuck in monotony and refusing to respond to this pull that God is exerting through the cosmos to move things forward, to move the story toward the ending that we heard in Revelation. Get to that in a bit. So the possibility of novelty or just chance, that stuff can happen that's truly new, is built in. It does not, we have to be careful at this point that it does not help then if we attempt some sort of theological sleight of hand here and saying, well, yeah, I mean, that looks like novelty, but that's really just God's entirely predictable way of sketching out a very predetermined plan to get everything exactly where it was supposed to be from the get-go. I want to just pause on that because that's important. What did you just hear me say? Let's see if we got this. What does that mean to you? Mary, I can see the thought balloon over your head.
I mean, just to say back what you just
Well,
said.
or in your own words, I mean.
Again, yes, that new things can happen, and it doesn't indicate that there was some God force that had this plan all the way along, which I hear all the time. You know?
Yeah.
Those who want to discount evolution say that, yes, God made it look like things were evolving.
You got it. So that was part of, we talked last week about the idea of intelligent design, which would be a way that we can account for what has moved things along. But to be careful about the word design, because what that conveys is that there was God is then more an architect than a gardener. As I think I said, you know, the blueprint's all there. I just got to get it all to exactly, you know, from the moment of the Big Bang or Big Bounce or whatever you want, whenever it all got started, everything was going to land just so. However, what we read about a new heaven and a new earth does not exactly say what that, I mean, a lot of things could happen to come to whatever that newness is going to be. And so that's key, I think, to tracking with at least what I've been trying to say. Now, if you don't want to buy that theologically, that's fine. Take that up with Dave later. But I'm just in the big picture of what we're trying to do. So I've been trying to stress that we can also, rather than see God as the master designer architect, we can see God as simply the giver of new possibilities, which I personally think is a lot more grand than God as an architect. It is, you know, this incredibly vast, you can't even begin to get your head around it, cosmos and all these years, and the possibility that in and through all that, new possibilities are really possible. And what does that mean to lean into that? It's another way of saying that the God as a nurturer or a gardener has given us a creation that keeps creating itself. Not that God is not involved in that, but it gets down to that very subtle issue of how is God involved in that. And we'll talk more about that with Einstein and what Einstein's understanding of God was. Okay, so if that's novelty or contingency or stuff can happen. All right. Counterweight to that in the whole cosmological thing here is predictability or pattern. A pattern, or what we might call natural laws. So, if you don't have any novelty, you've got monotony, right? Null. However, if you don't have some structure, you've got chaos. There's nothing, then there would be nothing discernible. So I guess this is sort of like the image we've used before, what grammar is to language. Grammar doesn't determine the plot of the story, but without some structure that everybody can discern, you can't have a story. You can't just throw a bunch of random letters and punctuation things on a page and get anything out of that. However, within the structure of grammar, you can tell all kinds of stories. You switch one or two words around, you have a different story, but it's still a story. So balancing novelty is the idea that there are some discernible, predictable patterns to things, so we don't have total chaos. So what we refer to as Darwin's law of natural selection, that this is the way we seem to have gotten to where we are, that various species rise and fall. They are selected, they self-select basically to move forward. And there's some kind of brutal realities to that. It's the survival of the fittest. The most adaptable move forward, the least adaptable don't. And that's maybe not real comfortable and messy. However, the patternness of that does present then the possibility that we don't have mere chaos, things coming and going at random, and this happens and then that dies out, and so it would be crazy. Theologian who I really like, Elizabeth Johnson, calls this spontaneity within an orderly system. I hope that's not just trying to have it both ways, but it does make some sense to me. It has to be some structure to things, but structure doesn't eliminate the possibility of spontaneity or newness. It just gives some framework to it.
Can you describe real quick
Yep.
what you mean by spontaneity and novelty?
Mhm.
Because I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure we're all on the same.
Well, what do you think I mean? And then I'll
Well,
correct you if you're wrong.
I mean, in the context of Darwin,
Yeah.
it's all about genes and gene mutations and some genetic trait that gives you advantage versus disadvantage.
Let me just pause there. Actually, for Darwin, per se, he didn't know anything about DNA. That hadn't been discovered yet. That's a second phase. That's what it
But
would.
he didn't have a concept of generational change, like this does better and
Yeah,
they
no.
reproduce and have
But-
offspring.
Yes,
And
that he had. But what's often referred to as the neo-Darwinists come after we get the idea that actually the way this happens is through genetic mutations of DNA. He didn't quite understand how it happened, but he accurately described that it was happening. That's kind of a fine point, but
it occurs through reproduction and
Yeah.
subsequent generations
Yeah.
of that species
Right.
showing the same trait.
however, okay, so novelty then means it's not quite clear why some genes mutate just the way they do. It's possible for something to pop up and then natural selection kind of sorts and brings that out. It's not absolutely predetermined that that the genetic structure of this plant or animal or you or me or whatever produces exactly the same thing next time around. There's always the chance something's going to shift a little bit. It only takes a little bit of I'm talking way out of my field here with DNA, but that things can actually come to a new place. It's not it's not an exactly set saying that, okay, from the very beginning of when everything exploded in the Big Bang, we could have predicted this was gonna happen just like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does,
But-
and
But
what I
anybody
think,
else chime in?
well, I think what's important is in the context of the book analogy
Yeah.
here, that this happens slowly over
Yes,
time.
yes,
And not like with an individual, and now we've got this change.
and you've just anticipated the third thing. Here, it's
Okay,
about
cool.
time, but that's good. Go ahead.
You compare that to this spontaneity of things like the effect of radiation on DNA and accidental things like asteroids
Yes,
in
right,
the Yucatan Peninsula and so on. So in that general orderliness that Darwin set forth, and we now know is affected by other things which are accidental or random.
right. Just have to ask yourself, what does it mean if you think about that asteroid from 66 million years ago that I'm pretty sure landed in the Yucatan and wiped out the dinosaurs? What does it mean if you say, well, God saw that from the beginning of creation, that was going to need to happen on that day at that point in history to take care of the dinosaurs so we could get to where we are? That's one way of looking at it. Or to say, this whole thing got set in motion where stuff like that could happen.
God
And what-
said whoops.
Huh? Well, that's an interesting theological question. What would God say at that moment? I think God, I mean, this is hopelessly projecting human stuff onto God, but I think God would have probably said, how are we gonna work this in? I want this to all come to fruition. This is interesting. I set up a deal here where that could happen. It didn't happen. Okay, now what? And how does that affect God? How does God move with that? And then what happened? I don't know if Naomi or is it
I
first?
just wanted
Okay, yeah.
to have you repeat that Elizabeth Johnson thing,
Oh.
but I didn't get the last part, but spontaneity.
Spontaneity within an orderly system. If you don't know Elizabeth Johnson, she's a wonderful feminist theologian, has written really good stuff on the meaning of the Trinity. But that's from an article she wrote called Does God Play Dice? That's going off of Einstein's quote, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, Naomi, please, yeah.
So like pulling off of like open and relational theology, thinking of like Thomas Ford, Tom Ward, there's an idea that some theologians have that God sees all the possibilities, right? So like a lot of theologies are like God is omnipowerful, omniknowledge, right? So that God sees all the possibilities, so that an asteroid hit the Earth doesn't really surprise God, because they saw this happening, right? And they can see what possibilities can bring forth that creativity, that bring forth love, that bring forth mutuality, and lure the creation to participate with them in new ways of being. So maybe God lured the asteroid to hit the planet because they saw like, well, this possibility will arise out of it.
So you use the magic word in there, maybe.
Right.
So, I mean, and now we're very close to the point in which we can't really talk and make any sense out of this, but the point is worth pursuing here a little bit. It's a question of when we come to our conception of who God is and what God is like, what's our investment in that? Are we trying to protect God or defend God or keep God small enough that we can manage? Or are we open to saying, well, it might have surprised God. Well, how can you make sense out of a word like that? That it was a truly novel, anything that happens is truly novel. You know, I may do something strangely compassionate for someone today that I would never move to do before, but I did. And I could say or do something terribly violent and out of character, but that I have some freedom and I can do that. how does God work that all in? And so I always want to be leery about ways of understanding God that are basically trying to be God's defense attorney and say, well, God wouldn't be that random or whatever. God's got to have a plan because I need a plan. I need to know. And that's about the best I can do with that. Maybe when we get into time, also that may give a different framework for some of this. But
within that framework though, like it, God doesn't have like an agenda, like doesn't think like this is the best possibility, so like this is the only way. Like sees all, so like there isn't a rating system.
Well, I would say not an architect with a blueprint.
Right.
That the house has to be looking just so when it's all done, but rather a gardener who says, I want life, I want color, I want nurture, I want nutrition, and whether the seeds blow in through the fence or somebody plants them, I don't care. It's going to get us there. So that's great. From the sermon, if you weren't here, that doesn't make any sense. Hopefully it made sense to people when they were here. Was there another thought over here? Okay. All right, well, let's talk about time then for a minute. So that's the third thing to kind of make sense out of evolution. John alluded to it a minute ago, that in order for the novelty really to become evident, it takes an enormous amount of time. Now, oddly, Darwin did not have in mind 13 billion years. He was thinking a couple 100,000 maybe, but really didn't have carbon dating on fossils and this kind of thing. He just discerned carefully the patterns of this shifted a little bit from that, and look what we've got now. We don't have any more dodo birds, but we've got eagles, whatever the case might be. So now this is pointing us now toward Einstein. We have come to discover that time is real. Now, again, I've said before, that may not strike you as any kind of novel thought. Well, of course it's real. That was yesterday, tomorrow's tomorrow, and blah, blah, blah. However, in a certain strain of science and philosophy, and what Einstein himself wanted desperately to hold on to and finally had to admit that his own math showed a different route, is that time is not just part of the fabric, what Einstein called space-time, but there are moments of things happening and passing away and coming into being and moving forward. Now, that's a lot to try to get our heads around, but it's essential for, as John was saying, for evolution to have enough time for things to come about. And maybe I'll hold just on some of that till we get talking about Einstein here. Maybe enough on that for the moment. So with Darwin, what does this mean theologically? Well, one of the things theology was forced then to admit and acknowledge is that this whole cosmological thing is kind of a mess, is really a messy business. There's stuff that happens that you don't foresee. Some of the weak don't survive, and the strong do. And that forced theologically having to wrestle with these notions of an all-powerful and completely providential God. Jesus said God knows every hair on your head, more of a challenge for some people than others, and cares for the sparrow and so forth. And yet here's Darwin saying, well, some of those sparrows just were genetically deficient and never made it. So how do you expand to think about God in a new sort of way? So that's a challenge. And now we come to Einstein. Just slight tangent for a second. As I put this whole couple of weeks together, I thought it made sense to start with Darwin. It may have made more sense to start with Einstein. Darwin came first chronologically, but Einstein takes you into a bigger picture. So I'm sorry if it gets jumbled up, but just for what it's worth, there it is. Let's turn to Einstein. Einstein's work, so Einstein is born, let's see, so Darwin publishes Origin of Species in 1859. Einstein is born in 1879. Okay, so he's a last part of the 19th, first half of the 20th century. Einstein work raises theological questions then about not just earthly life. That's really what Darwin is making us think about, and the evolution of humanity. Einstein's making us think about everything, everywhere, all at once, the entire cosmos. And the issue when we wrestle with Einstein is really, is there any meaning to any of this? Is there a story? We talked before about an outside story and an inside story. And is there any kind of a story, but especially is there an inside story that deals with the non-tangible, the metaphysical, the fact of our consciousness looking for meaning and order and promise and fulfillment and so forth. And then that pushes then the question of, is there anything like a personal God who attends moment by moment to this creation? So maybe in Einstein's conception of the universe, you could say, well, yeah, there's some, I don't know, some force out there that got everything going, but you know, given how everything happens, it's hard to assert that God is day by day, you know, having his eyes on the sparrow and watching over me, as that hymn says. So we're forced to grapple with those things. And again, we can try to play God's defense attorney and say, well, no, God's got to be able to do all these things that I always thought God could do. Or we say, no, maybe God does all these things in a very different, unexpected kind of way. Okay, so just a little bit about Einstein to get us into who this guy was. Probably, I mean, he's popular enough that this isn't news. Most people know, born in Europe, born into a family that was nominally Jewish. They weren't really practicing, but he was acquainted with the traditions of Judaism. You know, worked in a patent office in Switzerland, just kind of doodling in get his work done real quick so he could doodle with equations. And then he turns out to be a genius. In his early life, though, just in terms of personality, he was a little bit of an odd duck. He didn't talk till he was about 3. Worried his parents. They wondered if he was, you know, mentally deficient somehow. But it turns out he was just an extremely introverted person. And some psychologists who, you know, done some psychobiography suggest he may well have been somewhere on the autism spectrum, or even what's described as if you read about Einstein, you read this, a schizoid personality. Now, schizoid is not schizophrenic, big difference. It's simply, schizoid simply means it's something like being somewhere on the autism spectrum, a person who is not comfortable making human relationships, person who's very much unto themselves, has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with how you live and move in the world. And Einstein was a quite withdrawn person. He married early, and that marriage didn't last. No great surprise. He later married then again to, it was actually a cousin or distant cousin of his, who ended up being more, I think, like a parent to him than a spouse, who just realized he had certain childlike ways, and just give him room and space and let his genius flourish. Apparently, Einstein had moments in his life when he had brief affairs with other women, which again is an indication couldn't build and sustain a human relationship. Just, you know, reached out, touched that base, moved on. So casting no aspersions on it, just to say, is a complicated person, as almost all people of extraordinary genius are. But some of this is important in terms of how he crafted his science, and also how he described his understanding of whatever he held as his theology, which will unfold here. By the way, when I, in graduate school, I was at Princeton Theological Seminary and, which is on, Mercer Street in Princeton, New Jersey. Einstein lived at 112 Mercer Street. It was about, you may know this, about, two doors down from where the president of the seminary lives. So it's about half a block down from the seminary. I often walked by that house and people still knew that was where Einstein lived. I think there's even a plaque there now or something like that. So, you know, this genius was a real, true living being. And I've met people in Princeton in the late 70s, early 80s who had known him, still saw him, so forth. He worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies, which was just a big think tank. He never taught anything. He just created. Okay. All right. So theologically, what's Einstein's legacy? Well, Einstein's father was an engineer, and he grew up in that kind of scientific household, and said later in life that when he was younger, he went through some periods of sickness where he couldn't be out and do things. His father bought him a magnet or a compass that was magnetized, and he was absolutely fascinated with this, how this thing could, you know, point to true north, and what was how did that happen? You know, and he began to think all these things in an interior sort of way. But as he reported later, it was about 12 when he said there's nothing to the religion thing. He renounced any formal sense of Judaism or any other. I guess the way to say it, he figured out early on that he was going to reject any idea of a personal God. That just did not make sense. And he saw, I was thinking about this during the sermon today. Einstein would read the Transfiguration and say, it's just a story. You can't get anything out of that. It's a myth. It's somebody's ancient projection of something. And that was all there was to it. He was totally and absolutely committed to the discovery of the outside story of the cosmos, and apparently had no vision of an inside story. And I would say maybe even felt threatened by the possibility that there was. And that may have had something to do with his own personality and difficulty making relationships and so forth. For Einstein and he sometimes used the word God. And so if you read anything about Einstein, you'll see there, you go on, just Google Einstein theology or Einstein and God, you get a whole series of quotes. But we need to understand that when Einstein used the word God, he was not talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of the incarnation in Jesus. God for Einstein was whatever established and held together the irrefutable, unmutable laws of the cosmos, and that everything simply was, and that it held together, that was godliness. It's a very pantheistic way of looking at things, so that God is the universe and the universe is God. Now, did any of you know any card-carrying pantheists? But probably not. People, it's not very much in fashion. Although I would say there are many people deeply committed to science who would still hold that point of view. And I'm sure nobody here has ever read or studied the work of Baruch Spinoza. Maybe you did sometime, whatever. It was a Jewish philosopher back 17th century, but he was a pantheist who said, you know, all of this is God. And so Einstein frequently would say, I'm with Spinoza on the God thing. It's just not a personal God, but something cosmic and whatever. All right. When Einstein talked about religion, then, what he meant was not the worship of a personal God revealed in Jesus or whatever, but simply the sense of awe he got when he pondered the universe. And he said the only thing really amazing is that this is intelligible at all. In other words, that he could come up with equations that explained things. That was awesome. That was incredible. And that gave him a sense of reverence and awe. So I just want to accentuate this because to understand Einstein, it's important to understand what he did and didn't mean when he was talking about religion. He had a sense of awe, but it was the awesomeness of being able to put an equation on paper and then experimentally prove it and have it be have it come to life. Okay, so what I want to say, and I think I put this on the handout, for me, what this means is that Einstein disbelieved a God that didn't need to be believed in the first place. It's the so-called atheist who says there is no God. I always want to say, I'm pretty sure the God you don't believe in isn't the one I believe in either. You know, you've dismissed a caricature and haven't, again, gotten to the inside story. All right, let me pause there. That's a lot. Give me some reaction on this. Is this making sense?
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, why? I mean, that's true, but what boggles your mind? Because it probably boggles all of our minds.
Well, it's not in the mainstream. We've been conditioned over decades for ABC. Well, now we're going beyond Z.
Okay. That's Omega, yeah, okay.
It's a different way of thinking. It's expanding. And just to have the realization that there's something behind our ability to think and to consider possibilities.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Because again, our coming to a place where we're sitting here with the capacity to imagine, to think about the fact that we're thinking about these things, that's part of evolution. Consciousness has evolved. The creation is now aware of itself because we've got self-reflective minds. That wasn't here even 500,000 years ago. We've got a creation not really aware of itself.
Do you know whether he was aware of the thought there might be a multiverse and that this universe that we know is merely one unknown small part of a larger thing?
I was hoping somebody next week would raise that. Not really, let's talk about it. I don't know specifically. I just a vague impression I have from some reading is that he wasn't trying to argue that that could not be the case. I think he would say, no way to know at this point. I don't think anything in his math or geometry would necessarily preclude that. But again, he was very much into what you see is what you get. I can only deal with the outside story of what I can deal with in reality in the cosmos. Although, as we're about to see, some of his own math and equations pointed him away from his own thinking. And this was an emotional struggle for him. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, now in the next 2 minutes, I will explain special and general relativity. What are Einstein's biggest contributions? Relativity, and then how those theories laid a foundation for the Big Bang that we now can think about in terms of the 13.8 billion years. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, implications for how we think about time. Okay, the super short version of relativity. And if this doesn't make any sense, it doesn't matter, but you can't talk about Einstein without talking about this. Special relativity came first, and that theory, which was actually called On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, who cares? But anyway, he did not get the Nobel Prize for relativity, by the way. He got it for work he did on electrodynamics and whatever. Special relativity simply says, and this is the famous E is equal to mc squared equation, that as an object increases in speed, it gets heavier, its mass increases, and the faster you go, the slower time goes. So special relativity is really about the speed of light being a constant thing in the universe. Einstein loved that idea. There's something constant and fixed, and nobody has been able to disprove that. But the real insight here was that the faster you went, the slower time moved. And this has been experimentally proven. And it's useful because when you've got a satellite out there that's controlling your GPS, the satellite is actually moving faster out there 25,000 miles into space, whatever that orbit is, than you are down here on Earth. So there's a millisquidgen of time that has to be accommodated for, or else your GPS would have you a couple miles off from where you actually exist. So all that stuff, okay, that's very useful. So time is relative to the speed of light. Then that was just a kind of one particular instance of how the speed of light factored in. Now, general relativity, this is spelled, I put that equation on there, just, I have no idea what that means. I can kind of get energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared. That's E and mc squared. Okay, but the other stuff I have no idea. That's only one equation of about 10 that he came up with to explain general relativity. What's that all about? General relativity is basically about gravity. And that whereas Isaac Newton thought there was some mysterious force when you had two things, they attracted or drew on each other and kept balance. Even two things like this, or the sun and the earth, or whatever, there was some kind of balance. Einstein figured out mathematically that what was actually happening was that the structure of space itself was being curved. And that there is this thing called space-time, and that time and space are so tightly woven together you can't separate them. I don't even want to try to get too far into that. Only to say that in a way I can't begin to explain, general relativity did predict a Big Bang kind of universe. Because this whole business about the warping and the gravity and whatever allowed measurements eventually, I mean, Einstein did do this, but down the road, it allowed measurements to happen to see that light from distant stars was actually being bent through gravitational fields. And now we could begin to determine how fast that light was moving away from us and work the math back to say it must have taken about 13.8 billion years. There, nobody needs to go to grad school in physics. I just gave you the whole what does this mean? That's really what's at stake here theologically in all this. In one sense, time does portend death and the end of things, as many religious philosophical traditions have always noted. This is, that's it. And so time being real and Einstein's own math showing it, there will come a time when the universe as we know it cannot sustain itself. That's the second law of thermodynamics, that the energy that's been moving everything in expansion eventually isn't going to be able to hold everything up. Now that's volumes from here to Chicago. I don't know, it's way out there somewhere, but that does suggest that. But this also means that it does take a seriously large amount of time for real things to happen in the universe, even what's eventually going to take place as death. And that with that amount of time, there actually is a story in the universe. You can, over a large expanse of time, see that there's movement and things happening. As we said, even the development of human awareness, creation being aware of itself. Theologically, I think what that means is, as some theologians have pointed out, anything is endurable if you can fit it into a story. And even death can have meaning if you understand it in a much wider framework. Another way of saying that is death is real, but it's not final. Get the difference? There's a lot of funeral preaching that goes on that would basically be saying death is not fine, or death is not real, right? Your soul slipped out of your body and kept living in some other. No, what the creeds say is we believe in the resurrection of the body, and that death is real. Even the death of the cosmos will be real. The question is it final? I'm gonna get to Revelation before we end up here. So this idea of what's called deep time, these million, billion, trillions of years. What that means theologically is you got to be patient. You can't expect things to happen just on the drop of a hat. However, there are many theological religious impulses that want magic basically to happen. That somebody's got to step in and change it in an instant. And what the science of it seems to be showing us is stuff does change and it does happen, but it doesn't happen magically. It happens with its spontaneity within an ordered kind of a system. What it comes down to then, I think, is it helps us understand what faith means. In the author I've been quoting a lot and working out of God After Einstein, John Hott, Jesuit lay theologian. Just check out this definition. He says, faith is a disposition that lives off the sense of an unsettled future. A disposition, a life attitude that lives off the sense of an unsettled future. Faith waits for what is possible to become probable, and then it continues to wait for what is probable to become actual. So in that sense, this idea of deep time and a long, evolving, moving cosmos says that it is possible for real newness to happen. And I'm going to wait for the possibilities even to become probable, which for Christians would be to say the incarnation says to us there is a glimpse of the future coming into the present. This whole Jesus thing that wonderfully again talked about in the sermon today, it's probable that this is really what it's all about, this generous way of self-giving love and so forth. And now in faith, we wait until that probable finally in the eschaton, in the final revelation, becomes actually what the big story of the universe has been all about all along. That sort of meaning and beauty and coherence and rightness, whatever you want to call it. The irony of some of this is that Einstein himself didn't want to admit what his own math was showing, that time is really moving us somewhere. He wanted a steady state cosmos, and only reluctantly did he say, yeah, okay. Because his own math was what birthed what we talked about, I think, a little bit in the first week, the idea of quantum mechanics, where at the very small levels, subatomic levels of creation, or the vast, majestic, supernovas out there somewhere, at the big and the small ends of the spectrum, stuff is unpredictable. There's no way to know what a subatomic particle is going to do next. You can measure its position, or you can measure its velocity, but you can't do both at the same time. It all basically depends on how you look at it. And Einstein could not get his head around that. And that's why he said what's now a famous line, God doesn't play dice with the universe. Is that there's got to be some law that governs everything, even at the smallest and the biggest ends of the spectrum. Except his own math showed that that wasn't the case. And reluctantly, he admitted, but he still kind of hung on to this idea that, that somehow there was an explanation for this. But what experimental science keeps showing is in the quantum world, what you have are probabilities, possibilities, becoming probabilities, but not absolute specificity, which is part of the mystery and the majesty of all that. And so theologically, what I think this means then is, what kind of a God are we dealing with? We are dealing with a God who is, John Hott says, superabundant. God is a God of just incredible excess. Got all this stuff going on with trillions of galaxies. There's no small-time God. It's big stuff here, right? And so out of all that, all kinds of possibilities and probabilities emerge. And if you just go back to what did Jesus tell us? Prodigal son story. Bad name for that. Older brother story. Still a bad name for that. Best name for that story, I think, is the prodigal father.
Right.
prodigality means you're extravagant. There are no limits, we think of the prodigal son as being wasteful and extravagant, but the real issue in that story is the father image is the prodigal one. He's willing to give everything. He'll throw the whole big party, and he's not even waiting for a confession. It's just, it's all yours before you even tell me how sorry you are. So that's what the vastness of all this that's a theological takeaway for me from what Einstein is talking about. And I preached this at the Seminary Chapel about a year or so ago, that forgiveness does not depend on your confession. You confess, you're free to confess because you know that everything is forgiven. And a student came up to me just with the most puzzled look on her face the next week and said, I never thought of that. And I think it slowly sunk in. All I can say is go read that story. And there are other evidences of this too. The incredible extravagance of God is willing to accept all and forgive. And then our response to that is a thankful one. Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to say, I'm not going to confess anything, that's just being an ingrate. And I think that makes God very sad to the point of being wrathful, which is, I think, what the wrath of God is all about. I'll give you something nice and you're going to be thankful. Or would Jesus say, or would God say, oh my God, probably not. Okay. Okay. There are two more theological pieces here, which I think maybe because of time will be a nice lead into next week. Let me touch on them here. We'll get started next week then talking about hope and what is a legitimate form of religious hope and why that's different from wishful thinking. They're not the same. Optimism and hope are not the same thing. They're a little bit different. And then again, back to the sermon, you just intuited everything today. That what kind of power then are we talking about, given what we've learned scientifically here? How do we describe the power of God? And are we willing to set aside some preconceived notions to allow God to be big enough and expansive enough for us to not have to reject what science is telling us, but fold it into a larger story? So I hope next week, you can drop anything off you've thought about, or email me, or just bring your thoughts. But just the floor will be open for discussion, for questions, for not for me to impart information, but for you to share your own best insights, and maybe in the end a little bit of what I would call just some theological fine-tuning. Hopefully out of this we say, can rethink a little bit of that. It's what all this has forced me to do, and I found it sometimes unsettled, but usually an interesting process. So that's where we'll go. Any last thoughts?
We should think about a prodigal God.
How's that?
We should be thinking
about
a prodigal God.
Yes, we should. Rather than a stingy God who's out to get you if you don't behave yourself.
See, that's where I think religion and the focus on sin is too much of an emphasis. Should be more positive rather than negative.
I think I mentioned in the first week the letter I'd gotten from one of my graduate school professors who said, unless the church comes up with some things other than hell and guilt, we probably don't have much of a future. If those are the main things we want to accentuate, it's just not going to work for people. And yeah. That's a pretty serious challenge.
That line you had that was so engaging. Anything is bearable if you fit into a good story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually from a novelist. What's her name? Karen Blixen, I think.
Oh,
is that her name? It's not an exact quote, but it's close.
Close enough.
I can look it up for you. I'm not sure I can land on it at the moment. Do you know this person?
I've heard of her, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. It's my daughter took a course in college when she was at Pomona College called the storytelling animal, which is us.
Yeah.
It was part of her cognitive linguistic program, whatever. And she wrote a paper. I suggested the title to her, I'm proud to say, which is on about Bruce Springsteen. He loves to tell the story. And because his concerts are kind of like a revival, you know, he's got a story to tell you about life is tough, but you know, glory road, I mean, or something. And that we make meaning by telling stories, that's where the cosmos has evolved to. We can view these narratives. And so what will happen if we're no longer here? What will the story, well, we can get into that next week. Where will the story go after that? Is that enough for today? You've been really patient. Thank you.